What if I told you that right now, somewhere beneath the cold, dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, Australian sailors are learning to operate one of the most powerful, most lethal, most technologically advanced weapons systems ever built by human hands, a nuclear-powered submarine, under the direct guidance of the United States Navy? And what if I told you this arrangement, this secret underwater alliance, was born from a single phone call that shook the entire world, blindsided one of America's oldest allies, and permanently rewired the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific? This is not a story about ships. This is not a story about military budgets or defense contracts. This is the story of trust, of ambition, of geopolitical fear, and of what happens when three nations decide that the old rules of the ocean no longer apply. Welcome, because once you understand what is really happening inside this deal, inside the training programs, inside the submarines, inside the dockyards of San Diego and the waters off the coast of Western Australia, you will never look at the Pacific the same way again. Let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the moment everything changed. September 15th, 2021. It was a Wednesday. And on that Wednesday, three men, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, and Scott Morrison, appeared on screens around the world simultaneously to announce something that nobody outside their inner circle had seen coming. They called it AUKUS, a new trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And at the very heart of this partnership was a promise that America and Britain would help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Not nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered. The distinction matters enormously. These submarines would carry conventional weapons, but they would be driven by nuclear reactors, giving them virtually unlimited range underwater, the ability to operate silently for months at a time, and a tactical advantage that diesel-electric submarines simply cannot match. Now here is the thing that made this announcement so extraordinary, so seismic, so absolutely world-shaking. Australia already had a submarine deal. Australia had signed a contract in 2016 with France, a $90 billion contract, for 12 conventionally powered attack-class submarines. And when AUKUS was announced, that French contract was dead, cancelled, without warning, without any courtesy notification to Paris. The French ambassador to the United States learned about it from news reports. France's foreign minister called it a stab in the back. France recalled its ambassadors from both Washington and Canberra, an almost unprecedented diplomatic move between allies. The anger in Paris was volcanic. And yet, despite the fury, despite the diplomatic fallout, despite the questions and the doubts and the skepticism from every corner of the globe, AUKUS moved forward. Because the people who built it believed the stakes were too high to hesitate. China's naval expansion, Beijing's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea and beyond, the speed at which the People's Liberation Army Navy was building submarines, carriers, destroyers. The calculations in Washington and Canberra and London pointed to one conclusion. Australia needed a step change in its underwater capability, and it needed it faster than France could deliver. But here is the problem that nobody wanted to say out loud at the announcement. Australia had not operated a nuclear-powered submarine in its entire history. Australia's submariners, talented, experienced, dedicated professionals, had trained on diesel-electric boats. The Collins-class submarines, built in Adelaide, had served Australia for decades. But nuclear propulsion is a completely different universe. It requires different engineering knowledge, different safety protocols, different operational doctrine, different everything. You cannot simply hand a country nuclear-powered submarines and expect their crews to operate them safely. The learning curve is not steep. It is vertical. And so from the very beginning, embedded inside the AUKUS agreement, was a training mission, a vast, complex, multi-year, multi-location program designed to take Australian submariners and turn them into operators capable of safely and effectively crewing nuclear-powered vessels. And the United States Navy was going to lead that transformation. The first phase of this training program began almost immediately. Before a single submarine changed hands, before a single Australian boot stepped aboard an American nuclear boat in any operational capacity, the groundwork had to be laid at the most fundamental level. Education, theory, nuclear physics, reactor engineering, the science of controlled fission. American and British instructors began working with their Australian counterparts to establish what the training pipeline would look like. Where would Australian sailors go? What would they learn? In what sequence? Over what time frame? These are not simple logistical questions. They are questions of national security, of nuclear non-proliferation law, of alliance politics, and of practical military science, all tangled together. And those questions led to one of the most fascinating and underreported aspects of the entire AUKUS arrangement, the nuclear non-proliferation dimension. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which Australia had signed and which the entire international community relies on, contains a provision, Article 14, that allows non-nuclear weapon states to use nuclear material for naval propulsion under international safeguards. But no country had ever successfully invoked that provision in practice. No non-nuclear weapon state had ever operated nuclear-powered submarines. And so Australia's acquisition of these boats was not just a military decision. It was a test case for international law. It required years of negotiation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to develop a new safeguards framework, one that would allow Australia to possess reactor-grade uranium for propulsion without creating a loophole that other nations could exploit to advance weapons programs. The United States and Britain had to vouch for Australia at the highest levels of international diplomacy, and Australia had to demonstrate, over and over, that its intentions were purely defensive. This is the invisible architecture beneath the submarines, the legal scaffolding that makes the whole structure possible. Now let us talk about the training itself, because this is where the story gets granular, where it gets human, where it moves from geopolitics to the actual lived experience of young Australian men and women who found themselves in a moment of history they never expected. In the early phase of AUKUS implementation, 2022 into 2023, Australian naval officers and sailors began arriving at American naval installations in increasing numbers. Some went to the Naval Nuclear Power School in Charleston, South Carolina. This is the gateway institution. Every single person who works with nuclear propulsion in the United States Navy passes through this school. The curriculum is brutal by design. 6 months of pure academic instruction, nuclear physics, reactor plant principles, chemistry, materials science, thermodynamics. The washout rate, even among highly selected American candidates, is significant. For Australians arriving in a foreign country, adapting to a different institutional culture, learning an entirely new technical domain, the challenge was immense. And yet they went. They studied. They earned their qualifications. After nuclear power school comes prototype training, hands-on time with actual reactor plants in a controlled shore-based environment. Australian personnel embedded with American classes, learning alongside American sailors, qualifying on the same standards. There was no Australian-specific curriculum, no easier version, no diplomatic accommodation of the graduation requirements. If you could not meet the standard, you did not qualify. And that is important because the United States Navy was not doing Australia any favors in a soft sense. They were bringing Australians into one of the most demanding and unforgiving technical cultures on Earth. The U.S. nuclear submarine force has an almost legendary safety record. In more than 60 years of operating nuclear-powered submarines, the United States Navy has never had a reactor accident. That record exists because of the culture, the obsessive attention to detail, the zero-tolerance approach to procedural shortcuts, the willingness to stop operations when something feels wrong. And Australians were being inducted into that culture from the ground up. By 2023, the arrangements were becoming more formalized, more public, more operationally significant. In March of that year, March 2023, President Biden, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese gathered in San Diego to announce the optimal pathway. This was the roadmap, the detailed, phased plan for how Australia would actually get its nuclear submarines over the following decades. And it had three main stages. Stage 1. Starting in 2027, American and British nuclear submarines would begin rotating through HMAS Stirling near Perth in Western Australia, the base that would become known in the announcement as Submarine Rotational Force West, or SRF West. These rotations would not just be port visits. They would be extended deployments, with Australian personnel embedded in the crews, working alongside American and British submariners in an operational environment. Learning by doing. This is one of the most effective training methods in existence. Immersive, real stakes, no simulation. When you are on a nuclear submarine at sea, every decision matters. Every procedure is real. That experience simply cannot be replicated in a classroom. Stage 2. Beginning around 2032, Australia would purchase 3 to 5 Virginia-class nuclear submarines from the United States, subject to American production capacity and congressional approval. This was the part that generated enormous debate in Washington. The Virginia class is the most advanced nuclear attack submarine in the American inventory. Building them is extraordinarily difficult. The submarine industrial base in the United States, the shipyards at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, had been struggling for years to meet even domestic Navy production targets. The idea of diverting boats to Australia raised serious questions among American naval planners and legislators. Was the United States essentially weakening its own fleet to help an ally? Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Michael Gilday both testified before Congress on this question. The argument from the administration was that a stronger Australian submarine force was ultimately a force multiplier for American strategic interests in the Pacific, that the investment in AUKUS was an investment in collective deterrence, not a subtraction from American capability. Stage 3. The long game. Australia would build its own nuclear-powered submarines, designated SS and AUKUS, in its own shipyards, in collaboration with American and British technology and design. These boats would begin entering service in the early 2040s. The first would be built in Britain, with subsequent vessels built in Australia at the Osborne Naval Shipyard in South Australia. This is generational thinking. This is a 30-year plan, and it requires Australia to develop not just trained submariners, but an entire nuclear submarine industrial ecosystem. Engineers, welders, quality control specialists, supply chain managers, nuclear trained maintenance crews, the whole infrastructure of a submarine building nation. The training program, therefore, was never just about teaching sailors to drive submarines. It was about building a workforce from scratch. Let us now go deeper, quite literally, into the American side of this training relationship. Because the United States Navy's commitment to AUKUS was not merely institutional. It was personal at the level of individual commanding officers, individual instructors, individual crews who had to open their boats, their doctrine, their procedures, their classified operational methods to a foreign navy. In the culture of the American submarine force, secrecy is not just a regulation. It is a reflex. The submarine community is famously tight-lipped. Submariners rarely speak publicly about their missions, their capabilities, their tactics. They operate in what they call the silent service. And now they were being asked to share some of the most sensitive technical and operational knowledge in American military history with Australian counterparts. That required a level of trust that does not happen automatically. It had to be built, relationship by relationship, conversation by conversation, qualification by qualification. What helped enormously was the history. Australia and the United States have been military allies since the Second World War. Australian and American forces have fought together in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The intelligence-sharing relationship through the Five Eyes network, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States, means that Australian and American intelligence professionals already have deep, established channels of trust. The AUKUS submarine deal was, in one sense, an extension of that existing relationship into a new domain. But it was still an extension into extraordinarily sensitive territory. The reactor technology, the combat systems, the sonar capabilities of American nuclear submarines represent the crown jewels of American military technology. Sharing them, even with a close ally, was a decision that was made at the highest levels and debated intensely. Congressional oversight was a crucial part of this story. The U.S. Congress has specific legal authority over nuclear exports and transfers. The Atomic Energy Act governs what America can share with foreign nations regarding nuclear technology. AUKUS required amendments to existing law, required detailed classified briefings for congressional committees, required ongoing reporting and oversight mechanisms. Legislators from both parties had concerns about technology leakage, about industrial base impacts, about the precedent being set for other potential nuclear partners. Some members raised the question of whether sharing nuclear propulsion technology with Australia might encourage other countries, South Korea, Japan, Brazil, to pursue similar arrangements. The administration's answer was always that AUKUS was a unique case, justified by the unique strategic circumstances of the Indo-Pacific, and that the safeguards framework negotiated with the IAEA provided sufficient protection against proliferation risk. But the debates were real, and the oversight was serious. While all of this was happening at the policy and legal level, something quieter and perhaps more consequential was happening on the water. Australian submarines and American submarines were increasingly operating together. Joint exercises between the Royal Australian Navy and the United States Navy are not new. They have been happening for decades, most notably through the RIMPAC exercises held biennially off Hawaii, the largest international naval exercise in the world. But the AUKUS era brought a new intensity and a new purpose to these interactions. Australian Collins-class submarines, diesel-electric vessels that had served the fleet since the 1990s, began operating in close coordination with American Virginia-class and Los Angeles-class nuclear boats. The purpose was partly tactical, learning to work together operationally, and partly educational, as Australian personnel observed how American nuclear submarines conducted their business at sea. There is something profound about this moment in the history of Australian naval power. The Royal Australian Navy is a proud institution. It has its own traditions, its own ethos, its own history going back more than a century. Australian submariners, in particular, have a fierce professional identity. They are volunteers within an all-volunteer military, selected through an extremely competitive process, trained to operate in one of the most demanding environments that human beings can inhabit. And yet here they were, in the early 2020s, sitting in classrooms at American naval schools, qualifying on American reactor plants, learning American doctrine, adapting their professional identity to incorporate an entirely new technological paradigm. The psychological and cultural dimensions of this transition are as significant as the technical ones. How do you take a Navy that has operated one type of submarine for 30 years and transform it into something fundamentally different? The answer is, carefully, incrementally, and with enormous investment in the human beings doing the transition. The role of the United Kingdom in the training program deserves attention because AUKUS is a trilateral arrangement and the British contribution is sometimes overshadowed by the sheer scale of American involvement. Britain has operated nuclear-powered submarines since 1960. The Royal Navy's submarine service, based primarily out of Foslane in Scotland and Devonport in England, has decades of institutional knowledge about nuclear propulsion, nuclear safety, and submarine operations in complex environments. British instructors and liaison officers became an integral part of the training pipeline. Australian personnel spent time at Foslane learning British procedures, getting exposure to the Astute-class submarines that Britain currently operates, and building relationships with their British counterparts. The SSN AUKUS design, the submarine that will eventually be built in Britain and Australia, is based substantially on the Astute class, with American combat systems and technology integrated into the design. This means Australian crews need to be fluent in both British and American submarine culture. They need to understand the similarities and the differences, the places where doctrine converges and the places where it diverges. It is a uniquely complex learning challenge. Let us talk about the physical infrastructure changes that the training program required. The plan for Submarine Rotational Force West at HMAS Stirling, also known as Garden Island, located near Perth, required significant upgrades to the base to accommodate nuclear submarines. Nuclear boats have different berthing requirements than conventional submarines. They need specialized facilities for maintenance, for managing reactor systems in port, for handling and storing nuclear fuel safely. The United States and Australia agreed to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrading HMAS Stirling, not just for the rotational force, but as part of the long-term vision for a permanent Australian nuclear submarine capability. Workers from American naval construction firms began arriving in Western Australia to assess the facilities and plan the upgrades. Australian construction companies were brought in as local partners. The entire ecosystem of a nuclear submarine port was being built from scratch in a country that had never had one before. And here is something that almost never gets discussed in the coverage of AUKUS: the workforce challenge on the civilian side. Maintaining and eventually building nuclear submarines requires not just trained naval personnel, but a substantial civilian industrial workforce. Nuclear qualified engineers, reactor specialists, materials scientists, quality assurance inspectors who understand the extreme precision required in nuclear construction. Australia's civilian nuclear industry is minimal. The country has no commercial nuclear power plants, though that policy is under active political debate as of the mid-2020s. The talent pool simply does not exist in sufficient numbers. So part of the AUKUS agreement involved creating pathways for Australian engineers and technicians to receive training at American and British shipyards and nuclear facilities. Young Australians began traveling to Connecticut, to Virginia, to Scotland, learning not how to serve on submarines, but how to build and maintain them. This is workforce development on a national scale, over a generational timeline. It is one of the most ambitious human capital projects any Australian government has ever undertaken. The geopolitical context of all this cannot be understated. The years from 2021 to 2025 were years of profound strategic anxiety in the Indo-Pacific. China's naval construction program during this period was staggering in its pace and ambition. The People's Liberation Army Navy commissioned more warships in a single decade than most navies have in their entire histories. Chinese submarines, both nuclear and conventional, were being deployed with increasing frequency and confidence throughout the Pacific. The South China Sea, which China claims almost entirely as its own sovereign territory in defiance of international law as established by the Permanent Court of Arbitration's 2016 ruling, was the scene of regular confrontations between Chinese naval forces and the vessels of the Philippines, Vietnam, and other regional states. Taiwan Strait tensions rose and fell, each spike reminding policymakers in Canberra and Washington and London that the security order of the Indo-Pacific was not guaranteed. Against this backdrop, AUKUS was explicitly and deliberately designed as a deterrence measure. The argument was simple, even if it was controversial. Nuclear-powered submarines are the most capable and survivable naval platforms in existence. They are quiet, long-ranged, and extremely difficult to detect and destroy. A fleet of nuclear-powered submarines operating from Australia would fundamentally complicate any adversary's strategic calculus for the entire southern and western Pacific. The training program, therefore, was not just a logistical necessity. It was itself a strategic signal, a demonstration of American commitment to Australian security, a visible and expensive investment in the alliance. When Chinese military planners in Beijing watched Australian officers qualifying at American nuclear power schools, they were watching a message being sent. Capability development is, at its core, a form of strategic communication. The domestic political dimensions in Australia were significant and fascinating. AUKUS was announced under the Morrison government, a centre-right coalition, but implementation fell to the Albanese Labour government after the May 2022 Australian federal election. Here's where it gets interesting. The Australian Labour Party has historically had elements within it deeply skeptical of close military ties with the United States, suspicious of nuclear anything, and committed to a vision of Australian strategic autonomy. Some Labour left figures were vocal critics of AUKUS before the election. But Albanese, pragmatic and acutely aware of the strategic environment, embraced AUKUS fully. He flew to San Diego in March 2023. He stood beside Biden and Sunak. He committed Australia to the optimal pathway with its enormous price tag, estimated at between 268 billion and 368 billion Australian dollars over the life of the program. And he did something politically courageous. He took on the skeptics within his own party and won. AUKUS became, in effect, bipartisan Australian policy. And that bipartisan political foundation was essential for the training program to proceed with the kind of long-term institutional commitment it required. The price tag deserves its own moment of attention because it is staggering by any measure. Even the lower estimates of the AUKUS submarine program cost place it as the single largest defense investment in Australian history by an enormous margin. For context, Australia's entire annual defense budget in the early 2020s was approximately 32 to 35 billion Australian dollars. The submarine program would cost, over several decades, roughly 10 times that annual budget. Critics, and there were many, from peace advocates to budget economists to strategic analysts who doubted the value proposition, argued that this money could fund more immediately useful conventional capabilities, missiles, drones, aircraft, cyber capabilities, all of which would be available much sooner than nuclear submarines. The government's counterargument was that nuclear submarines provided a unique and irreplaceable form of deterrence that no combination of other capabilities could replicate. The debate was real, serious, and ongoing throughout the 2021 to 2025 period. Now let us return to the human beings at the center of this story, the Australian submariners in training, because I want you to understand what it actually felt like to be one of these people. Imagine you are an Australian naval officer. You joined the Navy perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. You volunteered for the submarine service. You went through the Australian submarine qualification process, which is already extremely rigorous by any standard. You have deployed on a Collins-class submarine, perhaps multiple times. You know the sound of that boat. You know its rhythms, its quirks, its mechanical personality. And now you are told you are going to America. You are going to sit in a classroom for 6 months and learn nuclear physics at a level of depth you never anticipated. You are going to live in Charleston, South Carolina, or near Groton, Connecticut, far from your family, far from everything familiar. You are going to be graded on your knowledge of reactor thermodynamics, of coolant chemistry, of emergency shutdown procedures. And if you do not pass, you come home without the qualification. The stakes are real. The pressure is real. And yet, by every account that has emerged from the program in its early years, the Australians were rising to the challenge. They were impressing their American instructors. They were building genuine professional friendships and mutual respect that will shape the alliance relationship for decades. The billets, the assigned positions, that Australian personnel filled during this period were carefully structured. Some Australians served as observers, embedded with American crews on submarine deployments, watching and learning without full operational authority. Others qualified in specific roles and took on real responsibilities within American submarine crews. The progression was deliberate, always expanding Australian knowledge and capability, always doing so at a pace that the Americans were comfortable with from a safety and security perspective. Trust was earned incrementally. Access was expanded as competence was demonstrated. It was, in a sense, the most elaborate professional apprenticeship in modern military history. The submarine rotational force concept, American nuclear boats operating from HMAS Sterling, created a new operational reality with profound implications. American submarines rotating to Western Australia would be operating from a base more than 2,500 nautical miles closer to the South China Sea than their home ports on the American West Coast. That geographic shift is operationally significant. It reduces transit time to areas of strategic interest. It increases the time submarines can spend on station in the Indo-Pacific. And it means that the Indo-Pacific becomes, effectively, the primary operating theater for at least a portion of the American nuclear submarine force. Australia, by hosting these rotational forces, becomes an integral node in American strategic power projection in ways that go far beyond any previous alliance arrangement. This is not just a training mission. This is a restructuring of the American military presence in the Indo-Pacific, anchored in the Southern Hemisphere for the first time. The Chinese response to AUKUS was intense and sustained. Beijing condemned the agreement from the moment of its announcement. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespersons called it a serious undermining of regional peace and stability, an escalation of an arms race, a violation of the spirit of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Chinese state media ran extensive commentary arguing that AUKUS was a destabilizing provocation, that Australia was sacrificing its strategic autonomy to serve American interests, that the deal would make Australia a target. Some of this rhetoric was clearly intended for domestic consumption and for diplomatic leverage. But some of it reflected genuine Chinese strategic anxiety about the implications of a nuclear-capable Australian submarine force operating in waters that Beijing increasingly views as its sphere of influence. The Chinese response was also, in a sense, confirmation that AUKUS was having the deterrent effect its architects intended. If Beijing was not concerned, the deal would not matter. The fact that it was very concerned suggested that the strategic calculus was shifting. Regional responses across Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific were mixed and nuanced, which is often overlooked in the binary framing of AUKUS as either a great idea or a catastrophic provocation. Indonesia and Malaysia, both of which are predominantly Muslim nations with their own complex relationships with the great powers, expressed concern about the nuclear aspects of the deal and about what they saw as the militarization of the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, issued statements emphasizing the importance of regional peace and stability. Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, American allies with their own concerns about Chinese power, were broadly supportive. New Zealand, as a member of the Five Eyes but not a party to AUKUS, navigated carefully, maintaining its long-standing anti-nuclear policy while not explicitly criticizing the deal. India, which has its own nuclear-powered submarine program and its own complex relationship with China, watched carefully and largely approvingly. The Quad, the informal grouping of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, gained additional relevance as AUKUS developed alongside it. Together, these two frameworks represented a new architecture of Indo-Pacific security cooperation that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The Collins-class submarine, Australia's existing diesel-electric fleet, underwent its own evolution during this period. These 6 boats, long criticized for reliability issues but staffed by crews of exceptional skill, were being extended in service to bridge the gap until the first nuclear submarines arrived. Life-of-type extensions, upgrades to combat systems, maintenance programs to keep the boats operational through the 2030s. All of this was happening in parallel with the AUKUS training program. The Australians were simultaneously trying to maintain their existing capability and build an entirely new one. The strain on the submarine service, on the personnel, on the infrastructure, on the budget, was enormous. Recruitment and retention of submariners became a major concern. Could Australia attract enough young people to the submarine service to fill both the current Collins-class crews and the growing number of trainees needed for the AUKUS pipeline? This was a question that naval planners wrestled with throughout the period. The industrial base question, on the American side, was perhaps the most contentious policy debate of the entire AUKUS era. Building Virginia-class submarines requires extraordinary precision, extraordinary materials, extraordinary workforce skills. Electric Boat and Newport News Shipbuilding were the only two facilities in the United States capable of building nuclear submarines. Both were struggling with workforce shortages, supply chain disruptions, and the aftermath of pandemic-era production disruptions. The Navy's own procurement targets, buying 2 Virginia-class submarines per year, were not being reliably met. And now Congress was being asked to approve the diversion of 3 to 5 of these boats to Australia. The arguments in favor centered on the strategic value of a capable Allied submarine force and the investments Australia was making in American shipyards. Australia committed to investing about $3 billion in the American submarine industrial base to help expand capacity. The arguments against centered on the immediate readiness of the American fleet. This debate was never fully resolved during the 2021 to 2025 period. It remained active, contested, and consequential. One of the most remarkable and underappreciated aspects of the AUKUS training mission was the extent to which it was reshaping the cultures of all 3 participating navies. American submariners who worked with Australians, who taught them, who served alongside them, who evaluated their qualifications, came away with a different perspective on the alliance. They developed professional relationships that crossed national lines, that created human ties more durable than any treaty text. British submariners at Foz Lane who hosted Australian visitors found themselves thinking about questions of doctrine and procedure that they had long taken for granted, asked to explain and justify practices that Australian Fresh Eyes questioned. And Australian submariners returned home from their training tours changed, more technically sophisticated, more internationally connected, more embedded in the global submarine community than any previous generation of Australian naval personnel had been. This is the invisible legacy of AUKUS, the human capital being built, the professional networks being formed, the cultural exchange happening at the working level of 3 allied navies. By 2025, the program had achieved several significant milestones. Australian personnel had completed initial nuclear power school qualifications in significant numbers. The exact figures remained classified, but the trajectory was unmistakably upward. Site preparation for the enhanced facilities at HMES Stirling was well advanced. Planning for the first American submarine rotations to Western Australia was in detailed development. The IAEA safeguards framework, that essential legal architecture, had been the subject of intensive negotiations, with Australia, the United States, and Britain presenting a joint approach to the IAEA Board of Governors that was unprecedented in the history of nuclear nonproliferation law. The process was slow, complex, and contentious, but it was moving forward. The decision-making timeline for the first Virginia-class submarine transfer to Australia remained subject to intense negotiation and significant uncertainty. The American shipbuilding backlog, congressional oversight requirements, and the sheer complexity of transferring a nuclear-powered warship from one navy to another all contributed to a situation where timelines were provisional and subject to revision. Strategic impatience on the Australian side, understandable given the deteriorating security environment, was tempered by the practical realities of what an enormously complex undertaking this was. No one had ever done this before. There was no playbook. Every decision was being made in real time, with incomplete information under enormous political pressure from multiple directions. What is perhaps most striking, looking at the full sweep of the 2021 to 2025 period, is how much had been accomplished and how much remained to be done. In 4 years, The AUKUS partners had created an entirely new legal framework for nuclear submarine cooperation. They had established training pipelines that were producing qualified Australian nuclear-trained naval personnel. They had announced concrete plans for submarine rotations, for submarine transfers, and for the eventual construction of purpose-built AUKUS submarines in both Britain and Australia. They had invested billions of dollars in industrial and infrastructure preparation. And they had done all of this while navigating intense diplomatic controversy, congressional scrutiny, regional anxiety, and the relentless strategic pressure of a rapidly evolving Indo-Pacific security environment. The men and women at the center of this story, the instructors at Naval Nuclear Power School who stayed late to help Australian students master reactor physics, the American submarine commanders who opened their boats and their professional culture to foreign colleagues, the Australian sailors who left their families and their country to spend months in foreign classrooms earning qualifications in an entirely new discipline, the British submariners at Foslane who shared decades of nuclear operational experience with Southern Hemisphere allies they had rarely thought much about. These are the people who made AUKUS real, not the politicians at the announcement podiums, not the diplomats negotiating safeguards language. The sailors, the engineers, the qualified professionals who chose, day by day, to rise to the challenge of the most ambitious naval training program of the 21st century. What ultimately drives this story, beneath all the geopolitics and the technology and the billions of dollars and the diplomatic controversy, is something very human. It is the recognition that the ocean does not care about your ambitions, that the deep is not impressed by press releases or summit declarations, and that the only thing that ultimately matters beneath the waves is whether you know what you are doing. And so three nations, bound by history and language and alliance, decided that Australia needed to know what it was doing in a way it had never known before. They decided that the investment was worth it, that the disruption was worth it, that the controversy was worth it, that the decades of effort and expense and complexity were worth it. Because on the other side of all of that, on the other side of the training and the construction and the deployments, sits an Australia that can go deeper, stay longer, and operate more quietly than any adversary expects. And in the mathematics of deterrence, that changes everything. The story of AUKUS is not finished. It will not be finished for decades. The submarines have not yet been transferred. The Australian-built boats have not yet been laid down. The rotational force has not yet begun its regular deployments from Western Australia. Everything described in this account represents preparation, foundation, architecture, the invisible work that happens before the thing being built can be seen. But the thing is being built, and the people building it, American, British, and Australian, are doing so with the seriousness and the commitment that the moment demands. Whatever challenges lie ahead, and there will be many, the years from 2021 to 2025 will be remembered as the years when Australia decided, irrevocably, that it would join the small group of nations capable of operating nuclear-powered submarines. And the United States Navy, more than any other institution on Earth, was the organization that made that decision real. The Pacific is vast. It is deep. And what happens beneath its surface, in silence, in darkness, at crushing pressure, that is where the strategic future of the Indo-Pacific is being decided right now. Remember that the next time you look at a map and see all that blue, there is a great deal happening down there that the surface never shows.